50% of global forests being felled since the dawn of humanity, to 375 billion tonnes of CO2 emissions since the start of industrialisation. Our impact on the natural world has only been matched historically by mass extinction events. Our resources are finite, but our appetite infinite. According to the IPCC in 2019, and again in 2021, the world has until 2030 to prevent the worst effects of a catastrophic climate breakdown. 8 years away. Millions of young people have taken to the streets over the last 18 months to protest the immediacy of this issue. In November 2021, the world will come together for the 26th Conference of Parties, COP26. This is the supreme decision-making body of the United Nations Convention on Climate Change. This meeting of world leaders is supposed to save us from the worst effects of climate change. How can a single agreement hope to tackle climate change in communities across the world? Is it too much to ask of COP26 to totally realign our global structures for a more sustainable future? This series will be exploring the challenges, stories, and effects of climate change on different communities and countries across the world. The United Kingdom, the Philippines, South Africa. Will COP26 make any difference for the farmers in the Eastern Cape suffering from drought, or the indigenous communities in the Philippines being flooded out of their homes? How can the global community act together to tackle the shared problem of climate change in a post-COVID world? We may not know the answer. All we know is that it's now or never. What does it mean to be one of the world's most climate vulnerable nations?
I'm actually quite anxious because the wind here is whistling. It's so strong. The heavy downpour is continuous.
Extreme weather events, rising sea levels. The Philippines is ground zero for climate change.
Tacloban has been flattened.
Experiencing over 20 typhoons every year. Worryingly, the intensity of these storms has massively increased in recent years, with 5 of the most deadly on record since 2006.
The Philippines is consistently ranked among the most vulnerable in the world.
Every year, there are multiple times that they encounter weather disasters. It has become a constant and consistent form of suffering for those communities.
Despite a population near 1.5% of the global total, the Philippines contributes a disproportionately small amount to the global emissions, around 0.33%. Climate change is not some in the near future problem for the Philippines. To them, it is very real and very much in the here and now.
Responding to the climate emergency is a moral and intergenerational responsibility.
So, who are these communities? And what unique challenges do they face? What support do they need in the fight against climate change?
I felt that I was alone in the universe, in the world, with no one to help me. I wasn't even really sure if I would survive. Being right there at the ground zero when it happened, losing loved ones in the aftermath, and carrying dead bodies, warm bodies, in the aftermath, it's something that we cannot dismiss and forget. It's something that humanity should hear of.
It can be hard for those of us who have never lived through the darker side of Mother Nature to understand the scale of the problem. In 2013, one of the strongest storms in human history battered the Philippines, and much of Southeast Asia. One of the deadliest typhoons on record, Typhoon Haiyan, killed over 6,000 people in the Philippines alone. With winds reaching over 313 kilometers per hour and waves over 7 meters high, the devastation was estimated at over $5.8 billion. Over 1.9 million people were left homeless and over 6 million displaced. Those who are affected the worst are often the most vulnerable. All of this with a greater backdrop of sea level rises for the same communities. It never stops, a creeping disaster.
I remember this expression that you will see your life flash in front of you when you're about to die. And it was already happening. I could see my childhood flashing in front of me. And I remember saying a short prayer. And the prayer was not for me to be saved, because I was already resigned that maybe I will die soon. And this is probably how people feel before they die. So my prayer was, I hope my family find my body in the rubble. That was my prayer. I can never forget that. Just right outside the hotel, when I got out, there was still a little bit of the flood. There were already some dead people, like on the ground. Some of them just floating. And I knew that it was gonna be a long ordeal. And it's gonna be a tough experience for me. Then I saw a couple of firefighters with wooden stretchers carrying one dead body. And it was obvious that they were having a hard time. They were also in shock. They just survived the storm. So I helped out, carry the body. So one body, two bodies, three bodies. I couldn't count. Couldn't count anymore.
How can you react to the next crisis when you've barely been able to recover from the last?
The issue of super typhoons and the disasters that it brings with it impacts communities in the long term. It's not just an overnight thing that we can forget right away.
There are diverse communities across the Philippines, each experiencing the effects of climate change very differently. Across the world, there are still millions of people who live in indigenous communities. From the mountains to the lowlands, the Philippines has a number of indigenous people spread across the country.
Climate change has affected our lives as indigenous peoples. We have had incidences of our tribal members being buried by landslides, and of course our properties are also affected with this changing of climate from extreme no rainfall to extreme rains during the monsoons.
Stronger typhoons would mean destruction of the entire crop. So actually crop loss is very common these days. Farmers in the past have not experienced this kind of damage, really. Farmers are starting to realize, I think because of consistent news that they have been hearing, they realize that this will be the new normal. They realize that climate change is real. It's not something that they question, it's something that they experience every year.